Hey everybody, welcome. So today I want to give more of a general overview of the analog waveguide. If you watched my previous video, it was a little rambly and disorganized. I had just gotten the module and I was eager to try it out and make some sounds, but I wasn't thinking too much about explaining anything. And in fact, I kind of assumed that anyone watching probably already knew about it anyway. But I realize that might not be the case. There might be people that really have no idea what this thing is and they're interested in learning a little bit more about it. So today I'm just going to explain the basic features and show some simple examples of using it. So to begin with, the module is divided into two channels, the X and the Y, that are basically identical, along with a section in the middle that determines how they interact. The X and Y channels both have an input, a gain knob to control the strength of the input, an output, a dry-wet knob to control the balance between the dry input signal and the process signal at the output, a send and return that are normal together and go into the feedback circuit. But if you like, you can use this to bring the signal out and process it and then send it back in before it goes into the feedback. Above this section, we have the feedback controls with a main knob, modulation input, and attenuverter. Above that, there is the cutoff for the low-pass filter, along with a modulation input and attenuverter. And then at the top, we have the pitch control with a 1 volt per octave input, main knob, an FM input and attenuverter, along with a switch to toggle between exponential and linear FM. Now again, all these controls are mirrored on both the X and the Y side, and they can both be used independently. However, the X input is normal to the Y input so that you can use the same signal to trigger them both. Now in the middle here, at the bottom, we have some link controls. We can link the pitch, the low-pass filter, and the feedback with these switches. When the pitch is linked, the 1 volt per octave input on the X side is sent to the Y side and then controls them both, as well as the main pitch knob on the X side also controlling the Y side. And if I turn this pitch knob on the Y side, we'll see there's a warning that says 1 volt per octave link on. Might be a little hard to see on your screen, but it's there in red. Similarly, when the low pass filter and feedback switches are engaged, these knobs on the X side will control also what's happening on the Y side, and the Y knobs will have no effect. Above the link switches is the rotation knob. Now this is kind of where the magic happens for this module, but we'll get back to that in just a minute. Then here we have the display, which is showing a graphical representation of the sound. And finally at the top, there's a modulation input for the rotation with an attenuverter for that. Okay, so let's make some sounds. The recommended input from the manual is just a short, unpitched sound like a click. So I'm going to be triggering the contour 1 from my key step 37 and just sending the output directly into the waveguide. Turning up the gain on the X channel and playing a key. You might have to listen very carefully to even hear that, but you should be hearing a click on the left side because I have the X channel routed out to the left right now, while the Y is being routed to the right side. But the gain isn't up, so you're not hearing anything on the right side at the moment. You also notice the display is showing a horizontal line. Now the sound doesn't really have any character yet because I haven't turned up the low-pass filter or the feedback at all. But if I do turn those up, we'll hear that typical carpless strong sound, this kind of bouncy rubber band sound. That's how I think of it anyway. Let's turn down the X gain and turn up the Y gain. And we're getting basically the same sound because we have the same input and the same settings on the filter and the feedback because the link is on, and the pitch. So also, I'm sorry, I am sending pitch info from the keyboard to the 1 volt per octave input there too. Notice the display now is showing a vertical line, okay? So this display is exactly just like an XY grid that you might use to graph an equation in your math class. And it's just showing the X channel along the X-axis and the Y channel along the Y-axis. So when there is no Y signal, we only have points graphing to that X-axis because the Y is 0. And vice versa when there's no X signal. If I turn them both up about the same amount, now we're hearing basically the same sound in both sides, and the graph is showing a diagonal line. So here's a quick math quiz. What's the equation of that line? The diagonal line going from lower left to upper right through the origin at a 45-degree angle. Well, that's the line y equals x. And so this is showing us that our X and Y signal right now are basically matched. So now let's bring in some rotation. If I turn that knob a little bit to the right, now we can hear some fluctuation in the left and the right sounds that we're hearing. And the display is also showing something dramatically different. Let me turn the feedback up a little bit more so we can see that more. It's kind of spinning. So what's going on here? Well, basically the rotation is controlling how the feedback is routed back into the X and the Y channels. When the rotation knob is at 0, then there's no movement in that respect. So the X is feeding right back into the X and the Y is feeding right back into the Y. If I turn that to a non-zero angle, then based on that angle, the points will be rotating. And I won't get into the math today, but I am thinking about doing another video on that if you're interested. But basically, we're using the sine and cosine of that angle and multiplying by the coordinates and recombining them in a way so that essentially it just rotates the point. And so what that means effectively for the sound is that some of the X is now transferring over to the Y, and some of the Y is now transferring over to the X. So the channels are mingling. And so this is happening kind of like every cycle of the feedback. And so that's why this looks like it's spinning, because every time it's rotating by this small amount of whatever angle I have set the knob at. And it's going to keep going around until the feedback finally dies off. So the more I turn it up, the longer it spins. Until you get these kind of trippy patterns that can just start oscillating out of control. Although over time they start becoming more and more circular, I guess, as the frequencies are filtered out. These patterns make me think of galaxies being born in the Big Bang or something like that. That's how I imagine they looked as they sprung into existence. So the rotation is what then turns this into a two-dimensional resonating model where you can get much more interesting harmonics. Some of them actually quite dissonant. So that's all going to depend on this angle. If the multiples of this angle go around the circle in a way that makes nice ratios, then we'll get more harmonious sounds. But in some positions, it's not going to do that, and we'll get these really dissonant gongs. When we get to 180, we're essentially just inverting the signal, so it's still, it's been rotated 180 degrees, and the X and the Y are now still effectively equal. And this knob is infinite, by the way, so you can just keep turning it around back to 0 and beyond, right? Just like 360 degrees is equivalent to 0, and so if you keep going to 720 and so on, you're just repeating the circle. Okay, so let's modulate the rotation. So the modulation here is normaled to the X output, so that the X signal, if we turn the attenuator up or down, the X signal will apply rotation. So the rotation will increase and then decrease with the strength of the X signal, creating more of this kind of boing type sounds. And if we turn it up a lot, maybe also turn other things up, we get these sounds that, to me, I like to think of it as being like an electric slap. Now I'm going to adjust the contour 1 a little bit. While it does work with the minimal attack and decay, I found that, oh, there we go. If you increase the decay a little bit, you get a little bit more body in the sound. Now that's nice. I can almost feel the electric shock. Of course, I'm also clipping a little bit. Turn down the gain. But even without the clipping, it still has a pretty electric sound there. Again, the amount of modulation as well as the starting angle will have various effects. We can, of course, patch something else into here, like an envelope. Let me do that now. And, you know, that might end up with a little bit more of a mellow kind of modulation of the rotation. Not really getting the electric slap anymore. So I'm sorry, the envelope is off camera, but I'm just playing around a little bit with the decay of that. Longer and shorter. Or you can increase the attack a little bit, but of course the sound already decays pretty fast, so that can have a limited effect. Okay, another thing we can do is invert one of the channels. I didn't mention these inversion switches yet, but each channel has one. And so the effect of that is to change the relationship to a mirroring relationship, where the feedback, instead of rotating, is mirrored across actually half of the angle set by the knob. So you see it's kind of making an X. So you get a rather different sound from that. Turn it off again, and we get back to this spinning pattern, right? Whereas with the inversion on, it tends to be these like expanding and contracting X patterns. Although there's many weirder things that you can get depending on your other settings and the input and all that. So speaking of that, the final thing I want to talk about is filtering the input. So in my last video I did this, but let me show it again. So by taking this triggering signal, this little click or short unpitched sound, and putting it through some kind of filter, you can get a much wider variety of tones. So in this case, I'm putting it into the Collide 4, which has a preamp with bandpass filter here. And so by playing with that filter frequency as well as the resonance and the width, whoa, you can get out of control quite easily. Let me, sorry, the Y channel is still inverted, so let me de-invert it for a while so you can hear kind of the more normal operation. get some really interesting harmonics from this. If you read the manual, it will explain. So a short clicking burst like this contains, in theory, all frequencies, and so by filtering some of them out, we control which ones are more emphasized in the waveguide. Now, by the way, I've been working with the low-pass filter and the feedback linked on the X and the Y. We can turn that off. Notice now the right side, the Y side, sounds much more muted because these knobs have been down. If I increase them a bit, the Y side will come out a little bit more. I also have to maybe increase the gain. There we go. It's a nice little spinning atom. This thing is kind of great just for drawing trippy patterns, like a spirograph, if anybody recalls those. If I invert the Y channel again, here we get that shallow angle. Well, one angle is shallow, the other is quite wide, but we get that X pattern. By the way, you can invert both channels, but basically the effect of that is then just switching everything by 180 degrees. So notice this sound. Let me take off the modulation on the rotation though. So right now each channel is in the normal position. If I invert them both, it does change the sound, but if I turn the rotation knob 180 degrees from the position it was in before, then I basically get the same sound as I had before I inverted both the channels. Of course, it can be hard to find exactly 180 degrees, but so inverting them both is equivalent to an 180 degree rotation, and so therefore you're not really getting much new tonality or timbre out of that. Rather, just doing one at a time has the most effect. And of course, finally, if you want maybe a little bit more of a melodious sound, you can track the pitch of the filter along with the pitch that you're sending to the waveguide. Okay, so I think that does it for this basic overview. I didn't go into the FM today, but I think we'll save that for another time. I think that's enough for one night. If you're interested in seeing more about this module, keep an eye on my channel because I will be trying to release more videos in the next couple of weeks. Really thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.